Hello and welcome to this introductory session on disability inclusion at work. My name is Professor Kate Sang. I'm a Professor of Gender and Employment Studies based in Edinburgh Business School, and I'm also the Director for a new research centre called the Centre for Research on Employment, Work and the Professions. I'm going to talk to you today about disability inclusion, but the first thing we need to do is to understand disability. So I'm going to give you a very brief introduction to who I am and an introduction to defining disability at work. And then for a full lecture, we would then move on to discussing some real life scenarios and the HR implications of those, and then also think about the lessons learned and how we can apply those to our own HR practice. So my name is Kate Sang. I'm a researcher with a particular interest in work-related well-being. So I'm particularly interested in equality, diversity and inclusion, around gender, disability, health, migration and in-work poverty. I'm also particularly interested in how these sources of disadvantage intersect to inform employment outcomes and employment experiences. I have been an advisor to the Scottish Government, particularly in relation to disability. I also advise charitable organisations, employers and employee associations and trade unions, all around disability inclusion and gender inclusion. So the research that I do is very applied. It's all aims to improve people's employment experiences and thereby also improving employer outcomes as well. For example, recruitment and retention of highly skilled workers. So what we're going to focus on today is disability inclusion. So the first question, if we want to understand how to be more disability inclusive, is to understand what do we mean by disability. So what is disability? Historically, disability has been viewed as a medical condition and a problem that needs to be solved. And this is the kind of language that underpins the idea of a person with a disability. So that is the medical model of disability, whereby we might identify an illness or a condition that was either something that somebody was born with, so congenital, or acquired later in life, and that then person would be considered to have a disability. And the aim of the medical model is to resolve disability discrimination and marginalisation by eradicating disability. So, for example, methods around this might include training autistic people to mimic neurotypical behaviours, or ensuring that people don't enter the workforce because that would require adjustments. So the view of the medical model is that disability is fundamentally a problem and it should be eradicated from the population. The further idea of the medical model of disability is that disability is something which is identified or diagnosed by a medical profession. So that also then implies a power differential between the patient and the clinician. In the 1970s, disabled people themselves led a political movement to eradicate the stigma around disability. And this then led to what is now called the social model of disability. So this is a disability-led theorization and understanding of disability. And under the social model of disability, we draw a distinction between impairment and disability. So impairment is, for example, a medical condition. So that could be a mobility impairment, it could be a mental health condition, it could be diagnosis of a neurological quote-unquote disorder, such as autism or ADHD. In contrast, disability is the social oppression that occurs when somebody with an impairment interacts with an environment which is not tailored or suited to their needs. So in other words, disability under the social model is a form of oppression. It does not reside with the individual. It's a consequence of an individual interacting with an environment. And by environment, we can mean the physical built environment. So for example, staircases versus slopes, but also social and attitudinal barriers. So for example, social barriers might include arranging events at different times of the day that are not suitable for those with chronic fatigue-related syndromes, or outright stigma and discrimination towards disabled people. So under the social model, again, we can see that an individual has an impairment, but they are disabled by society. And they are disabled by barriers that they encounter by interacting with society. And therefore, this takes us to a somewhat different orientation towards how we might manage disability. Because if disability occurs because of barriers, then the solution is no longer to eradicate disability. The solution then becomes to eradicate those barriers. And this is the model of disability that underpins the majority of disability research and also disability practice. We know in Scotland that disability is not an issue that only affects a small minority of people. So, for example, we know that around 40% of the Scottish population has a long-term health condition. And also Scotland has some of the highest prevalence of chronic conditions, for example, multiple sclerosis. So we know that if 40% of the population has some kind of long-term condition that could indicate disability, then we need to think about how do we support those individuals to secure work that is meaningful and also has job security with it. So now we'll just spend a couple of minutes thinking about disability at work. The main law that underpins disability inclusion in the UK is the Equality Act 2010. The Equality Act brought together various strands of equality legislation, and prior to 2010, we had the Disability Discrimination Act. So under the Equality Act, there is a very tight definition of disability. So you are disabled under the Equality Act if you have a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term negative effect on your ability to do normal daily activities. And employment is a normal daily activity. Under the Equality Act, disability is a protected characteristic. So that means you cannot be discriminated against, or you cannot discriminate against an individual directly or indirectly because they are disabled. Now, the key thing of the Equality Act is there are only a handful of conditions that automatically confer protection under the Equality Act, and others are determined by the severity of their impact. So cancer, multiple sclerosis, and HIV diagnoses automatically lead to protection under the Equality Act. So if an employee has been diagnosed with any form of cancer, any form of multiple sclerosis, or have an HIV diagnosis, they automatically have that protected characteristic of disability. And this places responsibilities on an employer in the UK to provide adjustments. So let's turn our attention back to this definition of disability. So we can see here some key terms. So we have substantial and long-term and normal daily activities. So we can see here that employment is a normal daily activity and that long-term refers to 12 months or more. So if I were to break my leg, that would have a substantial impact on my ability to do normal daily activities, but it would not be disability because I would heal within 12 months. If, however, I had brittle bone disease, and so I was frequently fracturing limbs, that would be something that lasts for more than 12 months and therefore would be covered by the Equality Act. So the key thing here is, apart from the conditions already mentioned that you can see on the screen, there is no list of disabilities. There is no condition that we would say outright is not a disability. Rather, disability rests on the extent to which it has an impact on an individual's daily functioning and also the length of time of that impact. In a full lecture, we would consider some of this with some real-world scenarios, but for now I will leave you with this definition of the Equality Act and ask you to consider whether this has changed your view of disability and how might that impact your practice in HR. Thank you very much.